Yeah, that was the intro for Your Hood's a Joke. Welcome to episode 1 of the podcast, everybody. We've got Cassie, Foad, and Edward.
Hello.
And our millions of listeners around the world at this very moment.
All 4 of them?
Exactly. We're just going to go
4 million.
4 million viewers.
That's a lot of people. That's millions.
This is a podcast that's an offshoot of a, dare I say, smash hit roast battle show in Toronto, Your Hood's a Joke, where we make fun of each other's countries of origin, where we're from, all different cities. We've got schools taking on each other, cities, countries, and whatnot. So the podcast is going to be about why people fight the way we do, why we have conflicts, why we have culture clashes. What does religion have to do with this? Why does Quebec suck so much? The big questions that are asked all over Canada every single day. So Your Hood's a Joke. Welcome to episode 1. To anybody who's never seen the live battle or seen our videos, I'm just going to quickly do a content warning. This is an extremely dark show. The whole point of the show is there's no such thing as a perfect country or a perfect group of people. Like I myself, the whole reason, just to talk about myself for a second, because this is radio, the whole reason I started this show is I've lived all over the world. Like I grew up in Russia, so you didn't know this.
I did.
You did?
I did know
so you've been
this.
stalking me. We just met today, and you know my whole life history.
The
Typical,
powerful.
typical American spy. No privacy. Okay, so I grew
You're
up in
the Russian here.
I know. Oh God.
Collusion. What's going on?
I always thought that would be an advantage. And then September 11th happened. And then 2016 happened. It's just been every single part of my identity has been a liability for my whole life. But there's a reason for that because, again, growing up in Russia, I've also lived in like South Asia, the Middle East, and places like that. Now here, and the most common trait everybody everywhere seems to have is we hate each other. People in India make fun of people from Bangladesh. People in Russia make fun of Ukraine. People in England make fun of France, things like that. Toronto, Hamilton, Scarborough, whatnot.
Ooh, what's that?
Oh, what, Hamilton? what?
What's
We have
Hamilton?
food.
You don't
We have food in the studio. Well, our guests are hungry and distracted. Perfect. So before anything else, I want for everybody to have a little taste of what the show is about. So we're going to play a quick highlight reel from some of our best roasts from 2017. Again, if you're listening to this for the first time and you don't like dark comedy, you can check off now. For everybody else, enjoy this little clip.
Poland, the country with the highest number of Jews per square kilometer, 6 feet under the ground.
There are rumors that Indian men beat their wives, but that's just how Rupee looks.
On a side note, it's ironic that Iranians have big noses since they hate Jews so much.
The wealthiest bank in Somalia is just full of treasure maps. And I'm roasting Somalia, the country that was only called Somalia because Hungary was already taken.
Sweet. That was a 30-second taste of the dark comedy haven that is Your Hood's a Joke. Off the top of my head, in those 30 seconds, we made fun of China and Somalia a couple times and India. Of course, we've got Cassie Cao and Foad HP. So, Cassie, you represented China a few times on the show, and Foad represented Iran a few times on the show. And one of the features of Your Hood's a Joke is that we bring up a lot of uncomfortable truths about each other's homelands, right? In today's discourse, there are a lot of questions about privilege and North American centric discussions about race and conflict. But people forget that this is a very universal trait. Everywhere you go, people are kind of racist, kind of prejudiced, because of invisible lines, invisible boundaries and things like that. I read the other day that, you cross over one invisible line and suddenly your average lifespan goes up 20 years, statistically, right? So, but there's no difference ethnically between those specific groups of people, except for the cultural differences they've, imported, over a few thousand years or so, standard human stuff. So we're here to basically unpack that and what's going on. Why do we behave the way we behave? So I want to throw it up, first of all, since this is a roast show. I'm going to throw it up to our comedians, and I'm going to kind of take the piss out of China for a second. Okay? So, Cassie,
Great.
you mentioned that, you grew up in Quebec.
I did grow up in Quebec.
You speak fluent French.
I do speak fluent French.
Quebec City
I can do both. I can do the Quebec accent and the French accent.
and the French accent. So, being in Quebec City
Yeah.
and speaking French
Yeah.
and looking like you,
Mm-hmm.
you're very Asian.
Mm-hmm. So Asian.
Did that work against you?
I mean, I was very little, so I feel like if there was racism, I probably wouldn't have noticed it. You know what I mean? At the same time, I was very aware that I was the only non-white person around.
I asked that because I grew up in Russia with this brown face speaking fluent Russian,
Right.
right? So you speaking French in Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
I have like a basis of comparison for that. And the most common thing people be like, you speak such fluent Russian. And I was like 4 years old.
Right.
I had no idea what that even meant. I'm like, why wouldn't I speak fluent Russian? I didn't know that I was different from those people.
Right.
And they weren't being mean or anything. They're just
No.
like, oh, they're just impressed you have no accent in Russian. Like the only language in which I don't have an accent
Yeah.
is Russian. Is that the same for you with French?
Well, I will say I find that Quebecers just really care if you speak Quebecois or not. So if you show up and you can speak Quebecois, they kind of will take you in.
Okay.
But even if you speak French with a bit of an English accent, they're like, get the fuck out.
Really? Because I speak English with a non-English accent. And yet I noticed, a bit of hostility. The first thing, and this isn't even a joke, this is even made up fact. The first thing that happened to me when I first stepped foot in Montreal, right? Greyhound Station, 2007. I went there with a bunch of my friends from university. It was a very mixed group. We had some Japanese kids, some Russian kids, a South African kid, and me. Step out of the Greyhound, go on the streets of Montreal, and the first thing, some random lady, because we were just chattering about it in English, trying to figure out where the hotel is, some random old lady comes up to us and she's like, "Speak French, whores."
But
Pointing
she said that to you in English?
yes.
Oh, that's so...
To the women in particular. She says, "Speak French, whores." All right? And then we're just processing that. She just walked away. She looked like she was 90 or something.
I will say Montreal is like the capital of mental illness. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Whoa.
For sure.
Wait, this is what happened then 30 seconds after that. We tried to get into the subway, the quote-unquote metro, and still discussing the old lady from 5 seconds ago. And as we're discussing it in English, another dude who looked like he was in his 40s, walking up the stairs, turns to us, again yells, "Speak French," and then walked away. And we're like, we hate this place.
Very important to them.
I'm not even joking. This was my first time in Quebec, and the culture there was so different. I asked with full sincerity, where do I go change my money? It's still Canada. I'm just sitting there going like, can I use this money here? I was looking for a bank, and my friends are like, you're still in Canada, you idiot. Come on. So it's a very, very different province when it comes, the rest of Canada.
I think it is true. I don't really remember anything in terms of racism when I grew up in Quebec City. I think because I was just too young. But I do know that because I've lived elsewhere in Canada as well. I've lived in New Brunswick for a bit. I've lived in Ontario for a bit. And the only time I've ever encountered overt racism was in Montreal. It was in the McDonald's on St. Catherine. And that's a great place if you want to feel bad about yourself.
I think McDonald's are like the global gathering point for racists of all kinds.
Especially since they started going 24 hours a day. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I've had some superb conversations.
Oh, it was like 10 in the morning on a Sunday. They were for the early shift.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's putting a showing in. Okay, well, that's Cassie. Thank you. Foad.
Yes.
Foad
Hello.
HP.
That's me.
Yeah, so you're doing well. You're writing for a bunch of Canadian shows. You've done Just for Laughs. You're a vegan.
I am vegan.
That is a point to be noted.
Yes, thank you.
Have you grown up in Toronto?
Yes, yeah.
Your whole life?
Not my whole life. I was born in Iran, and
Where in Iran?
Abadan
Okay.
is the city I was born in. It is the only city that was affected by the Iran-Iraq war when that happened in the 80s.
Why?
Because it's
Border?
Yeah, it's right on the border, and that's as far as Iraq got.
You are on the border of Iran
And I
and
was-
Iraq?
Very close.
Holy crap.
And I was born in the middle of the war because my parents wanted me to survive.
Well, that's a very, it's funny that pregnancies increase in wartime.
Oh, for sure.
Right?
Like, we're going to die. I'm not worried about condoms.
Yeah, no, it's that's Abadan. And then when did you leave?
So we illegally emigrated to Greece in '88.
Greece, okay.
And we were there for 3 years, and then we got visas to come to Canada. And if you want to talk about xenophobia, if you guys think Greece is xenophobic now, oh my gosh, in the 80s when there was nobody there but Greek people, fucking chef recommend.
Well, this is a good point I want to bring up. So, when you were in Iran, for example, how many non-Iranians did you see?
No, I don't remember a lot of non-Iranians when I was growing up there, but I've been back a few times and I've seen a lot of Indian people who speak better Farsi than I do. And they're like, "What's wrong with your accent?" I'm like, "Hey, wait a second, there's something wrong here." A lot of Russians.
Now?
A lot of Armenians, yeah.
Okay.
I was there in 2008, and yeah, when I was there, like a lot of Indians, a lot of Pakistani people, a lot of Russians, a lot of Armenians, and they all like speak fluent Farsi. Like they've fully integrated with the country. But
are they treated with equal rights?
No, like I don't know if they are. I don't think they are because my cousins were like, "Oh, they're those dirty Armenians." I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, see,
how did you know?
So the reason I bring that up is that's a very common sentiment in like 97% of the world.
I think so.
Right?
Yeah.
Like
this. That'll happen in China as
like
well,
you've been in. Have you been in China?
I was born in China.
You were born in
Yeah,
China.
yeah, I was
Oh,
born
okay.
in China.
And you left there when you were really young.
Yeah, I was 4.
Have you been back since?
Yeah.
Okay, so same question. Like you notice a lot of non-Chinese people there?
Well, China doesn't have an official immigration policy, so you can't immigrate into
They don't
China.
need one.
Well,
Immigration is birth. You just get brought into the world. A lot of countries who have immigrants coming in, they have a declining birth rate.
right.
China
of
doesn't
course.
have that problem,
No,
right?
of
Neither
course.
does India and
But also,
whatnot.
no one's like sneaking into China. Like that's not really a situation. No one's like the Chinese dream. Like no,
Maybe North Koreans? I don't know. They might.
well,
They might. Yeah.
They're just trying to make it to South Korea.
Yeah.
That's their first step.
Well, but the way foreigners are treated in China or in Iran, India, Russia, anywhere, more or less the same as most parts of the world, right?
Sure.
But we don't bat an eye when somebody in Russia goes, Russia's for Russians, Iran's for Iranians, China's for Chinese people. If anything, people on the left here would be like, don't get involved there, guys. That's their country. They get to. But this idea of like multiculturalism and having like a melting pot, that's a very Western, like global North, I guess is the term for that, right? So we say West and East and First World and Third World a lot, but a more accurate term is global North versus global South.
Right.
It's just rich versus poor, right?
Yeah.
So Australia is not in the West, but it is, and it's not in the North either, but it is the global North, right? It's actually Southeast. That's a perfect example. So in the global North, there's this ideology that, bring people in, let's all learn from each other, blah, blah, blah. It's beautiful. It's great. That's why I'm here. That's why all of us are here. Not one of us is white. Are you white, Edward?
I think it's debatable.
Debatable. So Edward, you are a PhD candidate at U of T's Department of Religion.
The study of religion.
Study of religion.
I teach in Diaspora and Transnational Studies.
Right, Diaspora and Transnational Studies. So that's perfect for this show. We're going to figure out why individually every country is so racist. But you said you're from America, from California.
I'm from California, but I grew up on the border between the United States and Mexico in a place called the Imperial Valley. And it was called that to attract settlers because it was so terrible. Nobody wanted to live there. So they figured if we call it Imperial, people will come. Unfortunately, my family was like, oh, yes, we'll go to the Imperial Valley.
So you don't look Caucasian.
No, well, I mean, what is Caucasian anyways?
Caucasus,
Yeah.
he is more Caucasian.
Yeah.
Because technically Iranian people are, what's that, Kafkazi. That is the
Caucasus.
So Caucasus, people from the Caucasus are called Kafkazi. Iran, Georgia, that's another one. They're like super white, super fair skin,
Yeah,
right?
Armenia, Azerbaijan.
Armenia, exactly. So they're Kafkazi. But when we say Caucasian, we really mean
White people.
European white, waspy white.
Waspy white.
Right?
Yeah.
Because Italian, people from the Mediterranean, they don't necessarily like to be called white. To your point, you said Greece. Greek people don't necessarily like to be called white. Even Russian people don't like to be called white.
Yeah, can I say from China, y'all look white?
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody looks white.
Exactly.
Like if someone said he was white, I'd be like, sure.
Well, yeah, because Chinese people also look all the same. Right? It's kind of like to whoever.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's that's the prevailing sentiment, right? Is that if you are from ethnicity X, everybody from ethnicity Y looks the same to you, right?
Yeah.
So like there's that, it's not like a great observation or a joke or anything. It's just that if you're from, like you said, you said Chinese people think everybody else is white or might.
I don't know. I do.
You do. Okay. So
I just don't like I'd look at you and I'd be like, I get it. You don't have like, the tallest nose or whatever, but I'm like, I would categorize you as white. Like I
Yeah.
wouldn't.
Right.
There's no other.
This is really interesting. Well, I mean, that just gets to the point that race is totally made up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's what I wanted to talk about is these things are constructed by us. And like we're going to sound like the ultimate, academic elite SJW downtown Toronto club when we say this, but these are made up constructs. However, in day-to-day life, they have very real consequences, right?
absolutely.
So no matter how made up they are, they're pretty real.
Just because
Right.
something is socially constructed doesn't mean it's...
Yeah, exactly. That's why I was like, where are you really from? And where are you really? So what is your ethnic makeup?
Okay,
Edward?
so my grandma calls us Okie Mexipinos.
Can I guess?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, you already said Mexico.
I grew up along there.
Filipino, I like it.
I mean, you said you were. It's from the American-Mexican border, right? So I
Yes.
assume there's like a South American influence in there. I was gonna say Ecuador for some reason.
Ecuador. Never gotten that one.
No?
No.
Okay. Well, so go on. So, yeah.
So my family are the descendants of 3 migrant groups that ended up in the Imperial Valley because they worked in the fields. The Okies,
Okay.
which were poor white people who had to leave Oklahoma during the Great
For
Depression.
white people, what's that?
Poor white people.
Well, I would say that there's definitely more poor white people in the U.S. than there's in
Sure,
Canada.
that's why Trump got elected.
Yeah.
Poor white people.
That's a whole different thing because there's also an economic factor there, allegedly. And it-
Absolutely. And I mean, their descendants are still fairly poor.
yeah.
So that they all couldn't marry rich white people because they weren't the right kind of white. So they married Mexicans and Filipinos.
Oh wait, what kind of white were they? Were they Irish?
They were a descendant of Irish mostly, but they were poor Okies.
So because you said they're not the right kind of white, what was the right kind of white?
Well, at that point, the right kind of white in California history would have been like landowners, growers, people who had assets.
So you're talking about this is a few generations ago.
Oh, this is definitely
Right.
a few
Oh,
generations
but
ago.
this happens here. I find it as an outsider interesting to watch white people together and then have them figure out classism among themselves. It's such an interesting thing to watch them battle it out.
These days, I find that the battle lines are a little broader too, though, right? Because 50, 60 years ago, there was a big, during the election of JFK, right? It was a big deal because he was Irish,
Yes.
right? Because the Irish have had historically poor fortunes in
He was
North
Irish
America.
and Roman Catholic.
Irish and Catholic, right? I remember that from The Departed. That was a great movie. That was a focal point of the film.
Infernal Affairs, much better film. I feel like.
Yes, of course, the original Chinese.
I appreciate
Tony
that.
Leung and
Cultural appropriation.
Chow, is it? It was a great, solid film.
Wow, you're so well.
No, I'm gonna check it out. But yeah, so there is. From 60 years ago, there was that whole, okay, are you Irish or are you Italian or are you, like all those other different, I use this term loosely, shades of white.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting fact that now there's all these coalitions, right? Brown people are extremely fractured, just to use an example, right? I'm half Indian, half Bangladeshi, which means both countries don't accept me, right? I've lived there. In that part of the world, outside of the global north, if you're in the global south, if you're the wrong ethnicity, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
And if you're mixed, nobody wants you, right? Absolutely nobody wants you. I am a minority in every country on this planet, without exception, right? But these days, people coalesce around larger groups, right? Brown people, white people, Asian people, black people. And then we've all collectively decided to live on native land. Right? So that's a whole different conversation altogether. But those battle lines, these are a little more broad because people find that their political fortunes are tied to bigger groups of people, right? You can't just go around splintering so much. It's a very divided but somehow united on each side kind of an environment, right? And it all goes back, you can't deny it. You can't deny that people think of each other as groups. Why is that in 30 seconds or less?
In 30 seconds or less.
No pressure.
No
I
pressure.
think part of it is people like to imagine themselves as something that's bigger than who they are.
Okay.
And it's bigger than the people immediately around them.
Okay, yeah, no, that's tribalism, right? So, like, for example, I read that you're only able to care about 150 people. Every human being, because of the size of our brain,
Capacity.
is only able to directly care about 150 people around them, right? So when you say, why do all these rich people hoard their money, take it offshore, not donate, blah, blah, blah. In their minds, they're probably doing quite well for society around them. It's an upper class of society, but they're like, I just gave 50 grand to the Philharmonic whatever or the TELUS Center for the Arts. I'm doing my, like, that is base level opera. I'm assuming everybody on minimum wage goes to the TELUS Center for the Arts. Like, they're just so disconnected, right? So in their minds, and it's the same like with me. Like, I don't care if Quebec burns tomorrow. You know, I mean, I would be very happy. I do care, but they're not within my 150 people that I care about, right? So some of it seems to be evolutionary, but there's a prevailing idea that no, we should be better than that we should care more. And there's a real backlash to it, right? Like, just to break it down a little local, we have Ontario's election in a few weeks, right? And we've got Doug Ford on one side, and then we've got this weird loose coalition, not really, of liberals and NDP and left-wing people on the other side. And what is most surprising, and maybe not so much, is Doug Ford, for all the allegations of him being racist, bigoted and all that, he has very strong immigrant support. Very strong immigrant support. My own mom on Mother's Day said she's voting for Doug Ford. She's pretty brown, right? So why would somebody who is that deeply rough and like shoots from the hip, doesn't really speak the way we expect him to speak, says a lot of things like we got to take care of our own before others, blah, blah, blah. So somebody like that has a lot of mainstream support, not just from extremists. Like, if you get 40% of the electorate, you're getting some moderates in there, like a big chunk of moderates, right?
I mean, to be fair, that kind of mentality is really prevalent in, well, I can only really speak to China. But in China, for example, lots of Chinese people support Trump because that kind of mentality of like taking care of ourselves first is very appealing to China, because China has historically been a victim of America taking care of things other than America.
Exactly.
So, and they tend to be business friendly and things like that. So I don't think China's like mad about it.
No, because also the ideology in the global south, and I think China is kind of right down the middle, but it's very similar to conservative ideology, right? Yeah. It's like take care of your own people who look like you, people who are in your country. And it's not seen as that crazy of an idea. It's almost seen like, of course we would do this. India is for Indian people, not for Chinese people.
Well, I think it has like, it like instinctively makes sense, even evolutionarily. Like, you want to be part of a group that's going to take care of you, right?
Yes.
You're not going to want to be a group that takes care of everybody. You want someone that's going to protect you.
Yeah, historically those people have been dictators. I'm going to take care of everybody. Translation, you're dead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Taken care of. Gulags, etc., etc.
And you don't, I mean, the reality is that resources will always be limited. So you're never going to want to support a regime that's going to equally take care of others over you, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just, But today, if we take that to Ontario, and you take that to, let's say, Belleville, Burlington, any of those places, right? And you're like, why do you think Doug Ford is doing so well? The answer they usually give is something along the lines of taxes, employment. But the other thing is, and this is a very salient point, is sanctuary cities, sanctuary provinces, migrants coming in, terrorist attacks and things. We've just had the van attack in Toronto, which was not related to any of that. This guy was just straight up mentally ill. He was an incel. I hope everybody knows what that is. If not, Google it. I don't want to.
INCEL.
INCEL, involuntarily celibate, aka cannot get laid, and blames women for it.
I just learned this word last week. It's really explained a lot about my life.
I am envious of how innocent you are. You do not spend that much time on Reddit, I imagine.
No, I do pretty well.
Also, I just want to say I feel like we should be a little compassionate to incels. I was an incel until I was 26.
Oh my god, that just but an incel
I'm 33 now. Just to clarify,
an incel is not the same as a virgin, though, is it?
Well, I was trying to have sex. It just wasn't happening.
Yeah,
but I wasn't angry at women. I didn't feel like I was entitled because I feel like I internalized a lot of stuff. So the reason I wasn't having sex and getting laid was because there was some inherent flaw in me that made me less valuable as a sexual partner. Whereas I feel like there's the other side of that incel camp, which is they're not giving it to me because they're withholding, because they don't like me, because they're bad people, sort of thing.
Yeah, incel's a thing that was totally hijacked by mostly white men.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it was a queer term, right?
Yeah, it was started by
a lesbian woman came up with it, I believe.
It had to do with but it was more of a funny, jokey thing,
Yeah,
right?
no, it
Initially,
wasn't a serious thing. And
it's
then
kind of like, nobody's gonna date me. I'm an incel,
Yeah.
blah blah blah. And
No,
suddenly,
I think it was actually a little bit more serious than that. It was
Okay,
how
yeah.
do we support each other? I mean, particularly thinking around this is a term started by a queer woman at the University of Ottawa.
Mhm.
It's how do I go about dating in a world that like just totally has no examples for me as a queer person? How does one go about that kind of thing? And so it started out as like a supportive little group for people to try to figure out, how to get into the dating life. And it got hijacked by, like I said, mostly white men who were trying to blame other people for their shortcomings.
so you're talking about young white guys.
Are
Are you talking about white guys of all ages?
Well, I think it's mostly it seems to be me to. I'm not an expert in it.
Mhm.
I actually have a friend who's an expert in this, ironically. But it seems to me to be mostly young white guys.
Mhm.
Also, there's a very interesting. So I'm like
That doesn't seem to be a label that you would apply to yourself, though, right?
a white guy.
No,
Like an
incel.
incel.
No, that's the whole idea.
They're proud of it.
They're-
Yeah,
into
no,
it?
I don't know if they're proud of it, but it is something that they've kind of latched onto as like a part of their identity.
I assume that was a thing like fuck boy, like other people say it about you and you.
No.
don't.
No, they call
No.
themselves incels. Yeah.
This has been around for a while, and
Yeah.
there's as a pretty involved gamer, it's extremely prevalent in the gaming
For
community.
sure, yeah.
Not necessarily calling yourself an incel, but using incel terminology, Chads and Stacies
Right.
and sexual
It's
redistribution.
a really good time to be a lady.
Is it?
Yeah.
Has it ever been? But what I found interesting about that van attack was, and I have a fair number of pretty hardcore conservative friends, right? And we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. But that morning, after it became known who he was and what he stood for, so many of them messaged me like saying, they were regretful, saying, I'm so ashamed of myself that I was hoping it was a Muslim guy. They were hoping for
Right.
it, not expecting it, not guessing. They
hoping.
caught themselves hoping
Yeah.
that
Please
it was
let it be a
that,
Muslim or
so they
something.
can now bring that fight here,
Right.
Because in Toronto this is a very intellectual debate,
Yeah.
or it was up until that point, where
Right.
what do you do with migrants, what do you do with refugees, what do you do with people who are here from like a very devastated part of the world? Culturally they are different. This is a fact. You can't just transplant people and expect them to assimilate immediately.
Right.
I would not last in Syria. I would not last in Syria for other reasons. But culturally, let's say 10 years ago, if I went to the Middle East with having lived here, it would be very difficult for me because, again, in the Middle East, I would be like tier 3. I'm a brown guy in the Middle East. In the Middle East, people from India and Bangladesh are migrant workers. They're laborers, right? If I go in there and be like, well, I'm a smart dude, I should have equal rights. No. Buddy, build that bridge or get the hell
Get the
out.
hell out, yeah.
Get the hell out.
And sorry, you can't. We took your passport.
I know a lot of people in my family and friends who go there to the Middle East to like be air conditioning repair people because that's a big HVAC and stuff like that because it's a hot desert.
For sure,
They need air conditioning and it pays well. But in terms of the societal stratification, they're not seen as equals,
No,
right?
definitely, yeah.
Their passports are taken away when they first arrive. They're sent back and whatnot. But it's a very different environment there versus here, right? And we kind of are okay with environments being different elsewhere, but not here. But we're seeing a real cultural clash in North America right now, right? It's an ideological clash where people don't want to talk to each other because they're liberal or conservative. They want to talk to each other depending on who they voted for. Like, it's not even a discussion anymore. It's just like, no, you are either a Nazi or you're a feminazi, but you're one kind of Nazi. You disagree with
I
me.
only know how to compare people in relation to Nazis.
Yeah, and the weirdest part is there's so much commonality between these warring factions, right? When people like fight about this stuff, they use the same terms. They use the same terms, but they use the same arguments with different terms,
For sure.
right?
Same tactics.
Yeah, exactly. Most of it is semantics, and a lot of it is not very, very different from each other. But I'm just digressing a little bit. The point I'm trying to come to is in Ontario, right? It's been liberal for 15 years now. There's a real chance that it's going to go conservative,
For sure,
unless people on the left coalesce around the NDP, form a minority government through votes. There's an outside chance. So Doug Ford's rise is directly related to what's happening in with Trump in the States.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. He's denying. I just saw a press conference this morning where somebody asked him, "What do you think about people calling you Canada's Trump?" And he said, "That's a fight in an election in another country. I'm concerned with taxes and
Of course,
you
of
know
course he's gonna say that.
the same stuff that any conservative leader would go on and on about. But he appoints a hell of a lot of bigots as MPs, right?
Yeah.
So, like, do you know anybody in your family who's voting conservative?
I don't, but I feel like a lot of conservative values or ideologies sync up with immigrant values, aside from like the xenophobia stuff. Like, I know a lot of immigrant people are like pretty homophobic, transphobic, even racist to like everything that's not them, sort of thing.
Absolutely.
So all these things that Doug Ford is doing kind of lines up with their ideologies, except for like obviously the racism towards themselves. But they'll kind of overlook that to be like, okay, just so long as he's keeping the gays out of office or whatever, right? So I feel like that's why a lot of immigrants do support him, because those conservative values kind of line up with those like closed-minded immigrant values when they come here and they're like, oh, this is perfect. And when he says something like, oh, we got to take care of our own, it's like, hey, he's talking about me.
Yeah.
It's like, no, he's not talking about you.
But the thing is, don't you think he is talking about them though? I get the sense that Doug Ford, and I get the sense that a lot of conservatives today, just from some friends that I speak to on a regular basis, a lot of conservatives today, they don't think of themselves as racially bigoted, but they are culturally exclusionary. I don't even want to say bigoted, because their thing is, I don't care what your skin color is. If you grew up here, you should have like Canadian cultural values, right? I don't entirely disagree with that. I don't personally
like maple syrup.
Yeah, exactly. There's that hockey and all that. I'm down with all of those things so far. Not gonna lie. I mean,
sorry instead of sorry.
Yeah. Like, why did three of us? We're here. Our families came here because China, Iran, India, all those places weren't working out.
Yeah.
Right. You're
I
here.
came here because my country wasn't working.
Yeah, exactly. You're here because America's not doing so great either.
You hear that, listeners? It's not working out for anyone, anywhere.
And to dial it back even more, your ancestors, it wasn't working out for them in Mexico either. That's why they went to California, which, by the way, was Mexico. Just
yeah, for the longest
California was
still is.
It's still California and Texas used to belong to Mexico. All right, so that's a whole different story. But
California, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico.
Yeah,
parts
pretty
of
much
Oklahoma.
like the West Coast, except for like Oregon.
Like literally, there's a state called New Mexico, right? But the point is that immigrants come here.
To be
Sorry,
fair, I mean, I don't want to put a damper on this statement, the point you're trying to make, but I will say my parents didn't come to Canada because it wasn't working out in China. They were doing great in China. Yeah.
Why did they come here for you? For the children?
At the time, because of the Cultural Revolution and, China being closed off, there was no emigration policy out of China for decades.
Okay.
And in the 90s, that was the first time that you could leave China. So it was seen as a status thing to be able to leave. But my parents only expected to come to Canada to get education, and they were intending to return.
Okay. But did they return?
I mean, obviously not. But, I mean, I don't want to out my parents or anything, but they're not entirely satisfied with the Canadian experience. I often catch them saying that, had they stayed back in China like their colleagues, because my parents had both already worked for 10 years. They had full careers set up in China. Had they stayed over there, they see what their counterfactual would have been, and they often wonder if it was the
Do
right
they
thing.
find that their values align more with Chinese, local values, than Canadian kind of liberal values?
I can only really speak from my personal experience, but our family is not terribly political. So I don't think that we really care that much about these broad political values. We care much more about social values.
Right.
And so we have a lot of, I mean, not me personally, but my parents have more difficulty integrating socially than they do professionally or politically. I don't think that's really much of an issue, especially Asian people tend to have a little bit easier on the exclusionary factors in Western society.
There's that whole model minority thing,
Sure, we benefit from a couple of positive stereotypes. I mean, I'm not going to get into it. It's not super easy for us.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I think we take more of a flack socially.
Right.
I think we have more difficulty integrating socially. So I think that's
okay. Well, that's what I was talking about is in immigrant communities, there's this split. And I know this, being an immigrant myself. We've got 4 immigrants here. There are people who come here and they want to adapt and assimilate, and there are people who don't.
Right.
And within immigrants, there's always a big debate that you're making us look bad. Both sides say that to each other, right? You're like, why did you come all the way here just to import all the shitty things you're trying to escape from, right? When you hear about like, you know, little enclaves that are trying to like live under Sharia law, for example, things of that nature, it's not very prevalent, but it only takes one example for that to become like a thing, right?
People love to blow it up.
Yeah, and people
Media, right?
people
They
latch
love to-
onto it. But
Creeping
it happens, right? But it does happen.
Yeah.
Not to say, I don't for one second believe Sharia law is going to be the law in Canada, because that undermines and
Fingers crossed. We're so close.
anybody who claims that Canada is going to be taken over by Sharia law really underestimates the strength of Canadian law. Okay, they didn't let First Nations law stand here. You think they're gonna let Sharia law in? Are you kidding me? They like that was a much older, much more prevalent culture that was here, and it got wiped the hell out.
Yeah.
Right? So it is underestimating the strength of Canadian institutions. No, they're not gonna let a foreign set of rules to
No,
be imposed.
definitely not.
That's just the thing.
Only
It's-
their own.
Yeah, exactly. So that's more of a political bait. But within immigrant communities, no matter what immigrant community you're in, whether you're Iranian, Chinese, brown, you know, miscellaneous over here, but there's always that schism. You know, like before, now that I don't hang out at family things anymore, but whenever I did, there was always that, oh, so and so is dating a white girl. Ooh, how dare he? He's forgetting his, you know, his cultural roots. And the other side would be like, no, that's what's wrong with that. What's wrong with mixing and all that? So these are conversations that happen in immigrant communities anyway. And the socially conservative side of that community does align themselves with Doug Ford and the progressive conservatives, right? It's like what you said. Well, when he says he's taking care of our own, he means me too, right? Because I'm also not so crazy about the gays and the Jews and all this, right? There's a lot of old school ideology that's at play here. And I get the sense that they're going to like probably win. The conservatives are probably
For
going
sure,
to win.
yeah, especially like you said, because it's been liberal for so long. I feel like everyone's just kind of pushing against it, and with Trump happening, I feel like it's really enabled a lot of people to come out with their like really shitty opinions and be like, it's okay for me to say these things in public. It's like, no, keep that to yourself.
But the thing is, it is okay to say those things in public in most parts of the world,
For sure.
right?
Yeah.
Not here.
It was just here, yeah. But
On
now
the
that's
other hand,
changed.
I kind of prefer to know who's a racist. Like
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't
No,
like you to hide it.
Yeah.
If you're gonna be a racist, like wear a little badge or whatever.
Yeah.
Sure,
No.
yeah. March down the street so we know who you are.
Yeah.
That'd be amazing. So I want to actually ask about who's racist to who in each country. So in China,
Oh man.
who do
Everyone.
Chinese people hate?
Oh, we hate everybody. Are you kidding me?
Yeah. Who's the group in the Far East? Okay.
Oh,
Who's the
within the
Chi-
Asian.
Who's
Okay, have you heard of the Asian hierarchy?
No.
Okay, so in Asia there is a racial hierarchy that is an unspoken
I can tell you
hierarchy.
about the Indian one too, but let's
And
go with
it's
this one.
no one has ever taught it to me, and we don't talk about it, but everyone knows, and we all agree on the ranking.
Okay.
But it's like it's actually like very simplistic. It really just like in China we discriminate solely based on color. So the darker you are, the more worthless
India
you are.
also, yeah.
And the lighter you are, the better you are. And that's so strict that like Chinese people don't get to be at the top of the tower. White people are still at the top of the tower.
Yeah.
Chinese people love white people.
No, that's a similar dynamic in India and Bangladesh as well. When I was in school in Bangladesh, for example, just a quick story. We had this tournament. We were invited to the soccer tournament being held by this American international school, and it was during our finals week. And all of the senior staff wanted to take the entire school to the soccer tournament where we were going to be represented and we're going to have a little team, except for one of our vice principals who's like, it's goddamn finals week. Why are we going all the way over there instead of studying for our tests? And the unanimous consensus was, well, because the white people invited us to their soccer
Are you
tournament.
kidding me? That doesn't happen every day.
Like, what are you talking about, man?
Listen, when white people invite you, you say yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, when I go to China, because I grew up in Shanghai and we have our own dialect, so I speak Mandarin, but my Mandarin is not very good. My what I speak at home is Shanghai dialect, and when I go home to China, and I go shopping in a mall, everybody speaks Mandarin. You can speak Shanghainese like if it's like a real, but like most people will speak Mandarin 'cause that's the language.
Okay.
And I have an accent, so I sound like I'm not from Shanghai. And they like will not serve me because I look like me, and so I have to walk in and speak English or French. Sometimes I speak French just to really, really get them, and then they like fall all over me.
Wow.
Or typically when I go back to China, I try to make friends with American expats, like white boys, and then you just walk. You waltz into places.
Yeah.
I made friends with this.
With your white escorts.
I mean, he was the whitest white man from California. He just like looked like a Mark Zuckerberg. So he dressed like shit, but had such confidence, like white man confidence. And we would walk. We would walk into these like 5-star hotels and we would test it. Like I would walk in by myself, and people would be like, "You don't stay here." And we would walk in together, and then nobody would stop us, and we would take the elevator all the way to the penthouse suites and just like look out the view. Everyone was into it. Yeah.
But I want to know about that hierarchy, the Asian hierarchy.
Yeah.
So who's at the top? White people.
White people.
Then Chinese people.
Within the Asias, though.
Yeah.
Like Japanese people are a little bit higher up, just because they tend to be closer to like the American culture and all that stuff.
Is it because they're taller and fair? Like
they're not taller.
They
Not
are
tall, but
taller.
they are very fair.
Yeah, they're fair.
I wouldn't say they're tall.
But I think they're
No, taller.
Taller.
they're not taller.
They are.
All right.
I'm gonna Google this
All
later.
right.
Average height of Chinese.
I mean, we've got Yao Ming. We're fine. All right, he's balancing out the average.
Excuse the average.
So you got so Japanese people are slightly above Chinese people. You think?
It's hard to say now. It was like maybe a decade or so ago, much more apparent, just because Japan was so much richer. Right?
But you said there's an implied hierarchy, right? Like, I'll give an example. So in the Indian subcontinent, which would include Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, if I'm not, and we're not even talking about Nepal and Myanmar. They can go fuck themselves.
Of course.
So there's the hierarchy right there. But in the Indian subcontinent, India is at the top, not just because of the economic strength, but because of Bollywood. Culturally,
sure.
everybody in that part of the world watches Bollywood movies, right?
Yeah.
So kind of like the equivalent of, I guess, the K-pop and all that being listened to in that part of the world. So you got India at the top, okay? Then you've got Pakistan and Bangladesh, which used to be one country. Bangladesh used to be called East Pakistan. They had a little fight. Just a tiny little war.
Just like a little
Millions
spat.
of people were
Lovers'
killing.
quarrel.
Yeah, just a little bit. 1971.
Blame the British.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. All that happened because the British don't know how to draw damn maps. Okay, they caused the India-Pakistan problem. They caused Israel-Palestine. Everywhere they go to, they don't know how to draw lines in a map when they leave. They're like that ex that blows up your house before they leave. Like the British Empire's like, yeah, see you later, but we're gonna fuck up your boundaries for the next 100 years, right?
Have fun sorting it out.
Yeah, exactly. So in that part of the world, you've got India at the top. Then Pakistan, because of size and also like some historical traditional things. Bangladesh is just a tiny little country. And what I never mention, and nobody out there mentions, is Sri Lanka, because ethnically they're so different from everybody. Sri Lankans have a bit of African heritage to them as well, from what I understand.
And Dutch as well, I think,
and
right?
Dutch, yeah. So
Portuguese.
yeah. So ethnically, they look so different than all other like brown people in that part of the world that they're not even considered as part of the conversation. There's a term called Desi. Desh means country. So Desi means off the country, from the homeland. When you say Desi, you mean Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. You don't mean Sri Lanka. You don't even mean Nepal. Nepalese people are a little more too Asian, for our liking.
They're borderland people.
Yeah, exactly. And forget about Burma, Myanmar, whatever is going on in there, right? So from Ali Wong's special.
Oh, the new one? I haven't seen
Not
it yet.
the new one, the first one, Baby Cobra.
Oh, yes.
I remember her doing the whole fancy Asian versus jungle Asian. Is that what you're talking about?
No.
Yeah,
special.
I will say, look, I mean, from like an objective point of view, I do think that Japan has like a little bit more of a glam thing. But I will say, because I'm Chinese, we hate Japanese forever. So when China takes over the world, I want it on record that I was loyal.
Okay, so Japanese people can suck it, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Hashtag Nanking.
Cassie Cao, 2018. So you got China and Japan. Now, what about South Korea?
So Korea's has historically been like nobody takes it seriously.
Oh wow.
Except
Really?
very recently, K-pop has become a big thing.
Huge.
And that's the thing, is I feel like when the Asian countries assimilate to Western culture, they get a little bit of a boost from being under the American umbrella. So then they get a little bit more.
So you
like
think South
shimmer.
Korea's benefiting from that?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, Seoul is gorgeous. The city itself, it's going to get nuked soon, but till then it's great. Because North Korea just pulled out of the a very
they pulled out?
high level meeting this morning because they were mad about South Korea and U.S. still doing a military exercise. So they're like, you know what, screw you guys. So that lasted 24 hours. That little peace treaty. So you've got China, Japan, and South Korea. But then who's under them? Like everybody else, Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Thailand. Do they even count Philippines and Thailand?
We like don't even really know them. We're just like, y'all are fine. We like Singapore. Singapore's rich.
I've been to Singapore. Singapore's amazing.
I mean, Filipinos are the Mexicans of Asia,
Mm-hmm.
right? Obviously.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
I've heard this before. I've heard it, and people have been like, and you're both. So
I know, but see, this is the thing, is that we all agreed. We've never had a meeting about it, but we all know.
Yeah, no, that's my point. That's like it's a very universal thing of dividing up your little piece. That's what I'm talking about. People everywhere behave like this. You've got that whole dynamic in China, Japan.
But you know what? What I have only understood Chinese racism, and it's very much just based on color. So if you're
it's called
just like,
colorism.
Yeah, but so if you're just a little bit fair, like I'm fair for a Chinese person, I get treated better than like a really dark Chinese person, for sure.
I haven't met dark Chinese people, like, because I would assume they were Thai or Cambodian or something.
No, because like if you're because ethnically I'm only half Han, which is the majority ethnicity in China. I'm half Manchu, which is northern China.
I thought northern Chinese people were also pretty fair. No?
Yeah, absolutely,
Oh, okay,
and that's why I'm taller than an average Chinese girl. I'm a little bit fairer, and so I get treated better in China. But the Chinese people that are more closer to the southern border, they tend to be darker than I do. Yeah, absolutely, and you can tell, like, I'm shades darker.
And the southern border, that's where the freedom zones exist, right? Those are zones where there's no laws and you can treat your workers however, and you've got like Nike making shoes out there.
Sure.
Like there are places called freedom zones, and you're free from rights. That's what a freedom zone is.
Good.
It's fucking brilliant
But
from a propaganda perspective.
But at least I find like the Chinese system of racism easy to understand. Like you understand the rules and you play within them.
Okay.
My roommate, she's Russian, and her mom doesn't like me. And I was like, I don't understand, because like even if I'm not white,
I know why.
Even if I'm not white, like I'm a good other type of like a non-white.
Not for Russian people.
Exactly. And she was like, no, her mom has this whole situation where she's like, I like them based on evolutionarily how close they are to Aryans.
Yeah.
And so she would like Foad better than me. And I was like, have we heard all the stereotypes?
But also, if she's Russian, she probably has a bit of that Soviet thing going on, and you would look like somebody from Kazakhstan. And they're not very fond of people from Kazakhstan.
Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, they all have the Asian eyes.
I feel like she did a lot of research to inform her racism, which I don't know if it's impressive or just extra crazy.
Yeah. No, that's just from living in Russia. I remember like the Russian term when I was growing up there for somebody who's like not very smart was Uzbek.
Oh no.
Uzbekistan is the country
I'm so
from.
offended. This is not a good show for you.
It was literally they were calling it was just a play, or just they were just making fun of people from Uzbekistan, which is a Soviet satellite country, and I've been there. It's very nice, but it's a very common thing. But so the Middle East. So you're from Iran. So
yes.
what's happening? What's the hierarchy there for you?
So the people we shit on in Iran are number one Afghans.
Yes.
And I find that's always the case with that kind of racial hatred. It's always the people that are the closest to you.
So you're going further east.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, like culturally, language-wise, I find it's always like Serbians and Croatians. Like they're so similar. That's why they hate each other so intensely. Same with like Iranians and Afghans. Like the language is almost exactly the same. Afghani people speak like an ancient Persian essentially, and Farsi now is like a very colloquial kind of casual language. So I can understand Afghan people when they speak, but it just sounds incredibly formal the way they speak. So that Afghans are our number one thing. If like someone's like, oh yeah, I'm from Iran, and they're like, oh, where? Like Kabul? Like, get the fuck out of here. Sort of thing.
So you've got Iran not liking. What about Pakistan? Because ethnically, it's just maybe another degree removed.
For sure, yeah, because it's just south of Afghanistan, and it's like the intersection of Iran and India. It creates Pakistan. Not as much with Pakistan. I feel like because Pakistani people tend to not speak Farsi. They'll speak Urdu, and I'm sure they do. A lot of them do speak Farsi, but not as often, I guess, as prevalent as Afghan people. And they don't look closer to Iranians, so there's like that easy distinction. So it's like, it's fine, you don't look like us, don't worry about it.
Nobody likes Pakistan.
Yeah, but like the Afghans look closer to us, so we're like, fuck you, man.
What about Iraq?
We do like the our version of a Nufi joke is like an Arab joke. We'll be like, oh, so an Arab walks into a bar sort of thing. So we generalize Arabs in general. Like we don't specifically say like Iraqi Arabs, but that's kind of what they do.
So, because for a lot of people, most people wouldn't know the difference visually between Persian people and Arabs, right? Arabs and Persians ethnically, is that an ethnic difference?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but visually in North America, for example, here, again, back to that Toronto van attack, Alek Manassian.
Yeah.
Kind of an Armenian name, right?
Yeah.
I was watching CP24 describe him with eyewitness testimony. I swear to God, white people called him Arab, non-white people called him white. Right? There was this Asian dude who's like, yeah, that guy, there's the young white guy driving. Then they cut to a white man who's like, yeah, that was a Middle Eastern guy driving. We're watching that video of him faking out the cop with the fake, with the phone,
whatever it was,
and you can get a clear look. And in my living room, people were like, no, that guy's white. No, that guy's Middle Eastern. No, we don't even like what. So it's impossible to tell, right?
Yeah.
Even with me, like in India, if you look at people from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, they're very similar in skin tone and like facial structure, just from like generations of intermixing now, right? I mean, I would be able to tell the difference just from knowing the subtle differences. It's just like you probably have a good eye for like Middle Eastern people, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, definitely. I can for the most part tell an Iranian person.
Can you tell different Asian people depending on their face?
I can only tell between Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. The other ones I don't know.
But like you would know if somebody is not Japanese, Korean, and Chinese, like somebody from Thailand or Philippines.
Yeah, but I wouldn't be able to distinguish.
But not this. I bet those people from those parts of the world will definitely know. I'm not from Indonesia. I'm Cambodian. Screw those heathens and whatnot, right? So it's just it always boggles my mind. I'm like, listen, that is your cousin. God damn it.
Yeah,
like, what are you doing here? I mean, you teach diaspora studies, right?
Yes.
You said? So
Transnational Studies.
that would definitely be included in your purview, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, for me, I always think about how ironic. So like, my family is of Latin American descent, Mexican predominantly, and Mexicans have always hated on Central Americans. There's a
Central Americans?
Central Americans, so
not even South America.
No, Hondurans, Guatemalans, Salvadorans.
Okay.
Wait, you guys aren't Central Americans.
No, interestingly, or
wait, Mexico is in North America.
Mexico,
no, it is. Yeah,
Mexico is in North America.
That's
if you even divide, right? So like in Latin America, there's only America. There's no North or South America.
Going back to the Mexican or Filipinos or the Mexicans of Asia, both indigenous peoples that were colonized by the Spanish.
Oh wow, man! What the hell? Spain, not South America Spanish, right? We're talking about.
We're talking about
like
Spain.
Europe.
Spain,
We're talking about.
Even if you're not white from Europe, you're colonizing other countries. Like, what's the matter?
The borderlands of Europe. Well, I've studied in Spain, and I've studied about immigration in Spain, and I was like, how did this country control 2/3 of the Americas? I just don't understand.
I mean,
with violence,
soccer? I don't know. It wasn't just like, hey guys, just play ball here while we steal your gold. I mean,
the irony.
By ball, I mean get stabbed in the chest.
The irony to me, so to go back to the point that I was making about Mexicans, Central Americans, is that if you ask a white person from the U.S. or if you ask a white person from Canada to tell the difference between a Honduran and a Mexican, they can't do it.
I couldn't. I'm not white even.
Yeah.
It's it comes down to like, you know your ethnicities better than anybody else.
It's also I think that there's a way in which all this stuff is happening against sort of like whiteness. I view whiteness as like a blob, right? It eats everything, and everybody also wants to be eaten by it.
Do you mean Blob, the mutant from X-Men?
No, I mean
because you just described Blob. Oh, so sorry, you're not a huge nerd.
Like
okay, good.
Amorphous blob.
No, I'm thinking of the Blob from the 1960s.
Oh,
the Blob.
yeah.
I was talking about the Blob from the X-Men comic books, where he's an indestructible giant white guy who eats everybody.
Well, that sounds like whiteness to me. I mean, I feel like there might be some social commentary there.
Those 4 people just tuned out.
But so back to that. So Mexicans make fun of Central America.
Yes.
So
particularly their accents, and that's where there's a. We haven't talked about language yet. But Latin America is a region where Spanish and Portuguese are predominantly like almost. I would say I don't know this off the top of my head, but I would say at least 90% of people in Latin America speak Spanish or Portuguese. There's a way in which like certain people's way of talking becomes a way of distinguishing them. So even though sort of like if you want to use like terms like race or ethnicity, even if white people couldn't distinguish a Honduran from a Mexican, from a Guatemalan, from a Salvadoran, there's a way in which those groups just also by looks, by like how a person presents like themselves,
Yeah.
but also via language, the type of language that people use, or the type of accents people have, the type of words people decide to use.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that's also a way that like class gets marked really.
Oh, absolutely. I have a friend from the Dominican, and he described Colombian people as their language. They speak the same
They speak
Spanish,
Spanish.
but it's a more sing-along kind of
They
Spanish.
sound like they're always ready to cry,
Okay, Colombians.
or like they're asking a question.
right. So like the way he described it
Upward
is
inflection.
like
Yeah.
Carlos in Colombia would be Carlito.
Uh-huh.
Something like that. It's like this-
Carlito.
Carlito. Yeah, it's a little
Ciao,
sing-along.
papa.
It's a little like cutesy.
But
and so-
Carlito's just like a pet name for Carlos, right? I feel like
The
it's...
diminutive.
No, in that's not what he was just using that as an example. He's just like a
Right.
Dominican dude, but he was trying to give me a layperson's,
Right, of
observations,
like the
how he
tone and
knows
inflection,
who is
yeah.
Colombian because their language is a little more flowery, a little more sing-along,
okay.
a little more emotional.
Right.
Right. So they add little flavors at the end of words
Well,
and things of that.
Same with like that's why Quebec has not retained any of the high status from France because
Yes.
they butchered that
Oh
language.
God. Speaking of which, I would like to get to my
Hey.
favorite segment now. DJ Russell over here with the technicals. We're gonna do so every episode we're gonna roast a territory that I personally dislike.
Boom.
And the launch episode, we're gonna give that great honor to Quebec, the province, whatever their shitty
Tabernac.
nickname is. They have earned this roast. So I'm not gonna lie. So what do we have in Quebec? If we have any listeners who are not Canadian, obviously Quebec is a bilingual province.
No, it's not.
No, well, for my joke, they were gonna be.
Only New Brunswick is bilingual.
Yeah.
What is Quebec?
Fully French.
French, yeah.
Oh, okay, well, I was
Yeah.
going to say they speak
Their
French
language
and
police.
alcoholism.
Hey.
Yeah. But they barely even speak French, to be honest. Like you said, anybody from France,
Yeah, no.
they don't accept
that's
Quebec.
not-
They're like,
I will say, people in France love me because when I go there and I speak Quebecois, first of all, they just think it's cute that I can even do it. But like, they call it, "Oh, you speak Celine Dion French." It's so cute.
I feel like adding Celine Dion as an adjective is a big diss.
Yeah, but they think it's real adorable.
Oh, you drink water like Celine Dion or something weird.
But she's like a legend there, right?
I don't know. Like the entire province is a front for the mob. It's the most corrupt province in
100%.
Canada.
It's huge, yeah.
Like-
Everything's run down. Like
Wasn't
everything's
one of
falling
their
apart.
mayors like a mob guy as of very recently?
Okay, your mayor was smoking crack as of a couple years ago.
Yeah, but we don't pretend to be high and
But
mighty
he's
and
dead
cultural.
now, so
R.I.P.
let's move on.
All right, so Cassie, what do you got about your home province?
I love Quebec, I will say. I had a great time in Quebec. Also, I need to find my jokes because I just texted them to Foad this morning and then I didn't bring them. So, okay, I got it. The Quebec terrorist group, the FLQ, le Front de Libération du Québec, famously bombed the Montreal Stock Exchange in 1969, which was coincidentally also the year Quebecers learned that Montreal even had a stock exchange.
All right.
All right.
In studio
All
judging.
right. We're gonna need some laugh tracks up in here. Modern terrorist groups like Al Qaeda killed the people of their enemies, like when they attacked New York City. The Quebec terrorist group, the FLQ, also killed the people of their enemies, deciding to attack Montreal.
Montreal isn't considered proper Quebec. Is that what it is? Is it like a liberal enclave or something?
It's probably not as white as Quebec City, I feel like, and they're like, fuck those people.
That's true, because Montreal is really the only city that could be a little bit diverse. Like, it attracts immigrants. There's
Right.
no immigrants anywhere
If there's a single Asian woman in Montreal, it's immediately more diverse. So you should go there soon.
I've been there. It's all right.
I'm not a big fan. What do you got there, Fawad?
Okay, in 1995, Quebec had a referendum to see if they should declare sovereignty from Canada, and the province voted no because no one wants to be trapped in Quebec.
That is true.
French language media calls Quebec bashing, what French language media calls Quebec bashing started after that referendum, which is when English Canadian media reports on Quebec using underhanded tactics like journalism and truth.
All right. Getting a little academic there. Are we with our roasts? What do you got,
Quebec
Cassie?
separatists have been trying to get Quebec to leave Canada for decades, but the people of Quebec always fail to vote in favor of separating. If the separatists were smarter, they would have just asked the rest of Canada to vote Quebec out.
I would so take that is a genius idea.
Thank you. I've redeemed
Quebec,
myself.
if
You guys didn't like
anybody-
that exchange joke? Whatever.
Anybody. I can't believe I didn't think of this. All right, so if the government of Quebec, or if you have one, it doesn't seem like they have a government most days, is listening, if you want to be separated from Canada, please let us vote on it. And we'll throw in Alberta just for free.
We'll make that decision for you, for sure.
What do you got there?
Okay. In Quebec, the word fuck doesn't have to be censored on TV because it doesn't mean as much to Quebec's francophones. Kind of like how Quebec doesn't mean as much to Canada.
I like that. Cassie?
Over 90% of Quebecers are Christians, which is weird because having to live in Quebec is proof that there is no God.
Oh,
Hey.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
snap. Double slam.
I like that.
Double slam. I like that. Do you got anything for Quebec? Do you
What's that?
Yeah, exactly. What is
That
that?
was the best part.
Quebec, France, but without the culture. But yeah, that was the roast of Quebec. A really cute little academic roast. We're trying not to piss off everybody on our first episode. We've so far made fun of a lot of different kinds of people. I'm going to move on to another segment. This is going to be free speech or asshole.
Hey.
Free speech or asshole. So again, this is Your Hood's a Joke is a very dark show, right? We always touch upon things like free speech. Who gets to say the things that we say on stage, right? It's a very touchy subject these days. And I find that it's a catch-all thing that no matter what happens, if somebody says something offside, they immediately yell, free speech. You're infringing on my free speech, blah, blah, blah. First of all, unless the government cracks down on you, it's not a question of free speech. You still get to say whatever you want.
Yeah.
Other people have the right to call you an idiot
Especially
for
if
it.
you're putting it out there in a public space. Someone,
Yeah.
like if I hear something I don't like,
Mhm.
I don't have to agree with it, but I'm also not going to sit there and be like, that's okay. I'm going to be like, I have an opinion that goes counter to that. Listen
Yeah.
to me, motherfucker.
Exactly. That is free speech.
I was doing a show at a club recently, and the host, whom I will not name, but Fouad knows, was
I can name him.
no.
After the show, tune in for the X-rated rated.
Okay.
We're dropping names. No
If
one's
you
safe.
listen to the end of the show, we'll get the gossip. He was very racist. He was very racist and sexist, and he would do a really offensive bit before bringing me up to stage every single night.
Oh my God.
And the headliner, I was really upset about it. I called him out during my set, but I was like actually really, really upset about it. I was like texting Fouad a lot about it afterwards. And
It's pretty hard to make her upset because she's very racist.
it's true. I'm the most racist. And I was talking to the headliner that night, and he was like, I understand that that's really offensive, but can't you just talk to him and ask him not to do that joke? And I said, I support 100% his right to do that joke. I would never tell him not to do offensive material. But if you're going to do offensive material, I'm going to make you look like an asshole.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is, again, free speech is a two-sided street, basically, right? Two-way street. You get to say something, you get to hear people's opinions on that.
Yeah.
But when your rights do get infringed is when the government steps in.
Yeah, if someone with authority steps in and says,
Yeah.
you need to stop talking, that's infringement.
Exactly. So
but
now-
if someone just offering a counter opinion, that's
Yeah.
not infringement.
Exactly.
You're allowed to spew your nonsense. I'm going to say my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's the case.
exactly. So we have, out of Scotland, the UK, well, my second favorite place after Quebec, Scottish comedian Mark Meacham, aka Count Dankula. So he got in trouble. He taught his girlfriend's dog, a little pug, how to do Nazi salutes. So in this video,
That's so cute.
the pug or the salutes?
Both. The whole thing. That sounds adorable.
So in the video, so I watched the video, and it's kind of like it's nothing particularly great or funny or anything. He's just falling around bothering this dog, saying things like, gas the Jews or Sieg Heil, and he was trying to get the dog to do a salute whenever he said those things, right? It's like a short video. He says he didn't expect anybody to watch it. It was supposed to be a thing and whatnot. Obviously, it blew up, and he was charged and convicted of committing a gross offense. Initially, it was misreported that he was charged with committing a hate crime.
Right.
It was a gross offense. And I think he has to pay something like £800. The thing happened in April, whatever his conviction and all that. So my question here is, does this guy have the right to do what he did? What do you think, Edward? You're a non-comedian.
do I think he has the right to do it? Yeah, probably he has the right, but he's also got to suffer the consequences, whether those be juridical in the form of a fine, or whether they be everyone thinks he's an asshole because it sounds like he's an asshole.
Well, yeah, so isn't that often enough, though, in today's world, especially if you're a comedian? The worst thing that can happen to you, really, is people not reacting at all.
At all, yeah.
With the three of us
for sure, 100%.
Yeah.
Silence is way worse than a groan or someone heckling. That's still engagement, right?
When
silence, indifference, that's so much worse.
When somebody like starts talking about this guy, Count Dankula, whether it's negative or positive. Now we're out here in Toronto talking about this guy. If nobody had reacted, if somebody had seen that and gone, this is tasteless, I'm just not going to give it the time of day, it would have died in September when it was conceived, right? It's the signal boosting that we do where we're like, I don't like this thing. Here, let me show you what it is. And another person like, share and share and share. Often it's
look
like,
how awful this is. Fuck this guy. Let me share it. And
let me give him all the views.
Growing,
And the population is large enough that it will make a career for him. There are plenty of conservative fans who would love that kind of a thing.
For sure,
what our judgment of that is irrelevant.
And now they're aware of him. And
exactly.
they know how to like tap into.
Because people now like have learned to monetize outrage, right? So
exactly.
like if you don't like something, don't
boost it. Don't
like,
boost it.
Why would you bother sharing it? That's insane.
Well, my answer to that, my opinion of that is people who do that are doing it to like virtue signal their own displeasure.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, look at my morals. I am opposed to this.
Definitely. And show people in their circles their like opinions and ideologies and increase their status in those circles. Be like, look how moral I am. I'm putting my foot down on this.
Like, I would disagree with Edward on that point where I think this is a question of free speech just because the government got involved. You know what I mean? Like, I do think he's an asshole for sure. Like, who follows around a dog and teaches them like Hitler's salute?
But I also just think like, I mean, I guess I don't know because I'm not being targeted, but like, I just think who cares? Like
Jewish people.
But like
no, that's I see what you're saying. It's just that, you know, if you are not of that group, it's not gonna like be as impactful to you, obviously. But at the same time, whatever this person is doing could have died a slow, painless death
for sure.
In obscurity.
For sure.
You know, like the same thing happened in Toronto a few weeks ago with the White Guys Matter show. So at the Toronto Club, there was a show on a Wednesday night called White Guys Matter. Nobody knew about this show till Tuesday night.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it was all over the internet. People are tweeting about it.
Yeah.
How dare they? They are... You know, I have my own opinion on that. Not going to share it right now because we don't have that much time. But what ended up happening is a show that would have probably had 12 people in attendance on a Wednesday night suddenly was sold out.
Right.
Again, because, you know, a bunch of left-wing activists decided that it's more important to share their displeasure of it than to just bury it. You know, that's another question of how do we deal with things we don't like? Do we just like let it live and die? Because again, if you don't like something, it's totally your right to not like it, right? If you wanted to die an obscure death in 2018, the best thing to do is not tell people.
Especially with online content. Like I feel like it's a little bit different if people are actively showing up physically in large numbers and chanting stuff, because then if there's no opposition to that, then the other people who wouldn't normally like, well, I don't know, I feel kind of bad, they see like, oh, there was no opposition to those people, maybe I'll show up next time they do that.
Yeah.
But if there's a group of people that are saying like, hey, this is bullshit, then people are like, oh, you know what, my instinct was right, I'm not going to do that.
Exactly.
But online stuff, like the best thing you can do is just ignore it, because the second you share it, that's increasing the potential viewership by an infinite amount of possibilities.
I mean, this Count Dankula guy could probably do a full North American tour right now.
For sure.
Just on the back of this one headline, I was fined for making a funny video. "Quote unquote funny." I didn't find it funny. Like subjectively speaking, it was just boring.
Yeah.
You know,
it was repetitive.
I'm like, oh, you're gonna make fun of the Holocaust. How new and edgy.
Man,
what is
edgy.
this, 1949? You know, it's not the
Give this guy a sitcom.
Exactly. It's not the most original thing, but it's not the most funny thing or interesting, but I know about it, right? So there's a way of handling things. So so just to get your opinion, so Count Dankula, free speech or asshole?
I think it's fine.
Free speech.
I would like to, especially because it's like an online video, I would like to say free speech, simply because I feel like if the Nazis were still around and in power and they saw this video, they would also kill him. They'd be like, let's go, buddy.
Oh, Pug, you're supposed to pick a German Shepherd, goddammit.
Yeah, not this inbred, smushed face.
probably Jewish dog.
So I feel like for that reason, I'm like, okay, if the Nazis would have killed him for this,
Yeah.
I think, let's say, it's counter to Nazi
Sweet.
ideology.
And obviously, you're on the side of asshole. You think
Yeah,
he's an asshole?
I'm
yeah,
on the
yeah.
side of asshole. I just think that there are some things that I don't think are funny.
Okay, no, fair
Yeah,
enough.
or-
That's humor. It's subjective.
But I think
I
just
don't
because
think
things are
so.
funny,
Mhm.
are not funny, sorry, doesn't mean that you can't say them.
No.
Yeah, but you have to deal with the consequences, and if the
Yeah.
consequence
Yeah.
is
But
an
that's
$800
fine.
pound,
But that's
pound
fine.
fine.
But why is it that he has to pay money? He's already getting a lot of backlash. People like you don't like him, and that's fine. Why wouldn't that be enough? Like, wouldn't that be
Yeah,
justice?
why isn't it enough? Well, in the UK, they have much more strict laws when it comes to hate speech.
But you know what? Like, I mean, sure, if those laws are already in place and he's operating within that like game, he has to play by the rules.
Yeah.
That's fine. But then the debate should really be whether or not those laws are even.
Yeah, absolutely. No,
I don't know.
I mean,
when it comes to something like the Holocaust and the genocide of Jewish people, I think
yeah.
I err on the side of caution. Also, I think that there's a way. This is how states work. You know, we come together, supposedly come together, and we decide what our minimum standard is. What are we going to deal with, and what are we not going to deal with? In this context, in Europe having to deal with post World War II, sort of like dealing with itself, their minimum standard is we're not going to accept Nazism.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah,
But are you
see-
saying if that video came out of like Australia that it would be better?
No, I personally don't think so, because I think Nazism is below my own minimum standard. I don't.
Well, it's what you're saying is that Europe, having dealt directly with Nazis, are more sensitive to Nazi content.
For sure, yeah.
But to answer your question, I think if it came out in Australia, the general reaction would have been the same, probably.
yeah.
He just wouldn't be fined because
Exactly.
Australia didn't find the fight the
Exactly.
Nazis, right?
Exactly.
So it doesn't even have to do with like the UK being extra sensitive to the Jewish people. It's more like, oh, we remember when 50 years ago they were here, which was, by the way, within most people's lifetimes in the
For
UK.
sure, yeah. There's still a
They're
lot
like-
of people who are
Like in here in Canada and the United States, because it's not the same continent, the fight was a little
Exactly.
like, I mean, obviously World War II,
For
Nazis,
sure,
blah
but
blah
it
blah.
was more distant. It
You
wasn't
didn't
at
have
home.
Nazis
Yeah.
in your city. London
home,
was
exactly.
bombed. London was
Yeah, for
bombed.
sure.
France was taken over.
Yeah.
So they tend to be very careful about that kind of a thing, right? It'd be a very interesting. That's a very good point. I'd be very interested if something like this. Actually, I wouldn't be surprised if something like this already came out of Australia.
Cool. Let's get all the continents.
Yeah. No, I remember Australia.
I'm always for hating Nazis, and I'm always for hating Nazi content.
especially with their like new resurgence that they're
Exactly.
doing. So yeah,
That-
definitely.
Yeah, that's why I don't agree with you that burying something will make it go away. Because clearly,
Oh, you're talking. No, you're talking about idea. I'm talking about in the context of comedians.
Yeah.
The worst thing to do a comedian is to
to
ignore
bury
that
them.
person. But if you're talking about an ideology that's on the rise,
yeah.
on that note, I would say yes. It's
Yeah,
better
talk
to
about
take it on head on and say
Mm-hmm.
this is wrong, because there will be a silent group in the middle, undecided, who are like, well, nobody seems to be objecting to this. Maybe this is okay, and suddenly their group grows over time. So it's very important to restate over and over, be like, certain things are not acceptable in this modern world.
But on the other hand, I just feel like that's a personal choice. Like, I know a lot of the people who did speak out against the White Guys Matter show,
Yeah.
like, it was really relevant to them, you know?
Yes,
so
yes.
if that's something that really offends you, like, that MC really offended me at that show,
Yeah,
then I'm
yeah.
going to speak about it. Whereas, like, that White Guys Matter show, it didn't really affect me. I didn't find that show interesting in the first place.
Yeah.
So I didn't feel compelled to talk about it. But,
Yeah.
you know, those people who talk about it, I wouldn't say anything bad about them either.
Well,
that's also
none of us here are black, right?
Yeah.
But
Sure.
having spoken to black comedians,
Yeah.
their problem with that title was that title directly makes fun of Black Lives Matter,
Absolutely.
sure.
right?
Yeah.
There's nothing really counterculture or being punk rock about making fun of an organization that's trying to change the system.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
BLM is not the status quo.
No.
They are against the status quo. You know, if you get cops being called because black people are having a barbecue or they're napping in a dorm,
Yeah.
or like this morning when a
Going to
real
Starbucks,
estate
yeah.
agent was just trying to
really?
look at a house.
No.
It's on video. A real estate guy, black dude, looking at a house, white lady neighbor, calls the cops, and the cops get mad at her.
Oh, nice.
And it's on video. She's like, he better hurry up and do what he needs to do. And the cops are like, shut up,
Shut
lady.
the
He's
hell
going to
up,
do what he
yeah.
wants to do. But the point is that is the status quo in North America and in the US and in the USA in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So Black Lives Matter is the punk rock organization in here. And
For
to make
sure, yeah.
fun of them is kind of punching down.
Definitely.
That would
Yeah.
be my take. You
100%,
know,
yeah.
it's not you're not really. There's the
There's
argument.
nothing subversive there, right?
Well,
Yeah.
the argument from the conservative side that I've heard is that BLM, Black Lives Matter, and their ideology is the cultural norm. being left-wing, being socially progressive is the cultural norm. Whether you agree with that or not is not what I'm saying, but the reason they thought the title White Guys Matter was so punk rock is like, oh, it's going to get all these liberals all, like their panties in a twist and they're going to be all blah, 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 because we don't get to say this. I'm like, yeah, when you really want to say this? Like, this is your punk rock cred?
But I think there's no like clear delineation between what is punk rock. I mean, that's like a fluid statement, right? Whereas right now, it is true that like left-wing ideologies are typically mainstream. So there is a new unpopular but growing group of people who think the new punk rock thing is to go after social justice warriors, going after liberal ideologies, especially when they're being hypocritical, which like has merit as well. It's just that unfortunately the it's like a double negative, right? Like being anti-liberal can either be too meta if you understand what they're targeting, or it can just look like you're being a racist.
Well, I would like to say I don't think there's anything punk rock about a group of white boys complaining about being white boys.
But here's the thing, it's the good thing you brought that up, because that group, that's not what they were doing. A lot of their jokes were about how they shouldn't be complaining.
Yeah, absolutely.
If anybody actually showed up to the show, they would notice, because I personally know all of them. And while I can't speak for all the people on, because there's some comics who got into the show last minute, the ones that were billed, I know they're not like bigoted.
Absolutely.
They're actually pretty smart people. And one of them, his whole set was about how white guys are the dominant group, so what the hell are we complaining about, blah blah blah. Their marketing of it was extremely inflammatory, right? And as comedians do, you don't back down, you kind of double down on your stubbornness. It's a double-edged sword. That's the kind of attitude you have to have in this business. And I bring that up because this show is very, very unfiltered, right? Most of the comics on the show are racialized, so that gives us a pass, right? In the current discourse, if this show, Your Hood's a Joke, where you got people from different ethnicities making fun of each other, if this was run by a white dude, it wouldn't get the pass that I get.
It would be called Divide and Conquer.
Yeah, exactly. Boom. Developing shows over here. That's my Australian spin-off. Right? But I get a pass because I'm not white. The two of you get a pass to say all the horrible things you said about China and Iran because you're not white, right? But imagine if it was Divide and Conquer. It was two white guys talking shit about India and Portugal and South America and stuff like that. It would be, so there are nuances to this, right? And it comes down to, the way I see it, some groups have had a historical disadvantage and some groups have had a historical advantage, right? So whether you subscribe to that or not really depends on how educated you are and how much money you have, right? I mean, Chris Rock says that, right? He talks about how there are more poor white people in the U.S. than there are poor black people, right?
Yeah, but they're disproportionately. There are more black people.
As a percentage of the black population, there are more poor black people.
Yeah, so I think that the balance is there is how do you figure out a way forward where you care about poor white people and poor black people, and those things aren't mutually exclusive.
But see, that's a good point you again brought up, because if I have had this conversation with left-wing intellectual types where I'm like, okay, well, what about the economics of it? And it gets shut down. You're basically called a Bernie bro at that point. You're disregarding race and this, that, and the other. It's not just economics. You're just some centrist Chad who, blah, blah. Centrism is such a problem these days. You're not allowed to be a moderate. People talk about, that
draw a line.
This kind of that old horseshoe theory. You're aware of it. So like the shape of a horseshoe, like on the two ends are two extremes, right? Left wing and right wing extremists. In the middle is you got centrists at the top of the horseshoe, and basically the idea is the further you go to the extreme of your ideology, you end up circling back to the opposite, right? So extreme left wing people tend to speak and behave like extreme right wing people, right? But in today's discourse, people make fun of that theory. They're like, oh, you're just some baby boomer, stuck in the 70s who doesn't understand the nuance of today, blah, blah, blah.
But I think, like, going back to earlier when we were saying people, like, humans only really have the capacity to know and care about 150 people at a time. Like, a lot of these are just political divides for you to understand what the other person is, right?
Yes.
Whereas if you were intimately aware of another person who had different ideologies, and you would feel more comfortable having an actual discourse with them, right?
Absolutely.
Which is the same as like when I felt much more comfortable writing a lot of my roast jokes because Fuad and I were already friends.
Right.
Had I not known him, I would have felt very uncomfortable doing at least half of that material.
Yeah, I've had that dynamic happen. There's been a lot of battles where the comics don't necessarily know each other, and then they'll meet 20 minutes before the show, and they're like, "Oh my god, I'm gonna write so much worse shit now," and they'll like go harder. So there is that, and that's a good point. Like basically, if you don't isolate yourself into your own group, you might and hang out with. If you actually make an effort to hang out with people outside of your group, you might develop this thing called compassion. This new thing called empathy.
Oh man.
You know.
My
I would say the
God.
onus there is it's just on white people though. White people love to point out how black people, people of color, how indigenous people, how Latino people love to hang out with themselves. But I think part of that is a reaction to being excluded from white spaces.
Uh-huh.
Right?
I mean, yeah, there's no doubt about that in particular. I think that it's just my own experience has been to adapt wherever I've gone to. So I tend to err on the side
that's
of
the hustle.
Yeah, well, that's
But
where
it shouldn't be your burden to do that, you know?
Should it?
Shouldn't be the outsider's burden to necessarily integrate into...
no, some of it should. Like I mean, I might sound pretty conservative there, but like if I live in a country and like Canada, for example, I'm gonna use like I'm brown. Let's say Bangladesh, right? And this is an observing, just having observed live on the ground. If a lot of people from other countries want to immigrate there, let's say it's, I mean, for whatever reason to Bangladesh, let's say they've suddenly become a great, powerful country. Why wouldn't I expect people to adapt to the cultures of that land?
Yeah, to some degree, not like completely assimilate, but
No.
definitely take on aspects.
Well, because
of
you're
it.
also assuming that you're the one who necessarily wants to emigrate, but you're forgetting Canada invites immigrants to come in, and
they do, yeah.
proudly tout like having the cultural mosaic
Yes,
and
yeah.
everything. There is a responsibility on the part of the majority.
That is a
accept.
government policy, right? It's not like people on the ground are like, hey, let's bring more people in. There's a declining birth rate in Canada, Germany, United States, places like that. On an official policy level, they want to bring people in. The Canadian health minister is lowering health requirements now to bring in immigrants. That's kind of set off a firestorm amongst people who are like, we have a burdened healthcare system already. Why are we bringing people with lower? Because I had gone through that same system, and there's actually a pretty rigorous way of testing, you know, what kind of diseases you've had. They'll do a whole thing before they let you in. I don't think that's unfair. Like the Canadian healthcare system is for people who live here,
For sure,
right? And if you're going to bring in people to this rather robust system, I think you have a certain right to be like, well, we don't want to fucking overburden this.
Yeah.
No, of course, but I think that we were talking about like social inclusion. I would
Yes.
say that if you ask a random white person on the street, chances are he'll tell you that he is for multiculturalism,
Yes.
or she. And given that like anecdotal sort of, you know, overall sentiment, I think that there is a greater responsibility put on the part of the majority group to include minorities when
Right.
they want to say that they're inclusive.
Right.
If you want to say fuck immigrants, like Trump is saying, at least like we know. you
Right.
know?
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, I guess it's just I've just bounced around so much, and it's just my personal experience that adapting to a country.
You have internalized oppression.
I am. Oh yeah. See, yeah. Not the first time I've heard that either. Like, oh, you're internalized. I'm like, no. I have just been outside of my own personal suburb. I'm sorry. That's the difference here. I tend to sound more conservative when I say things like that, but this is just a very, I find, human reaction. Be like, if you're coming to my house, well, take
No.
off your shoes at least,
Yeah,
man.
but you know what? It's not black and white, right? I'm not saying that
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
responsibility one way or the other way. I mean, it has to be if like the immigration process is an agreement between two parties.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
everybody
yeah.
has to give a little.
Is that that's something that you would come across in your in
Yeah.
diaspora
What I
studies?
would say though is that there's probably we have to look at things in like a longue durée, right? So you say that Canada's health system and healthcare is for people who live here, but I think that the exclusionary process has preceded the healthcare system, right? We have to think about like what makes Canada a wealthy nation.
Right. No,
Mostly
yeah.
oil extraction.
Yeah, there's a lot of history and historical context to all of this.
Canada
yeah.
is a settler colonial society.
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
I'm not even Canadian, but Canada has a history of treating Indigenous people certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about inclusion in a place like Canada, we have to think about inclusion as being sort of like the next step in this long history.
Okay. Yeah.
Which I don't know. I feel like I might disagree with you a bit.
No,
about-
for sure. You're absolutely allowed to do that.
Yes, thank
That
you
was
for
always
my
allowed.
free speech.
But I will run you over with the car after the show for disagreeing with you.
And to go back to your horseshoe comment, I've seen some white boys get into cars and run people over, but I haven't seen any social justice warriors do it yet. So I think
we have time. This dimension is a very weird dimension. I don't know if you've noticed.
Very weird timeline.
Donald Trump is president. Kanye West is white. Is white, and Eminem is black now apparently. So yeah, okay, cool. Final word before we end the show. I'm gonna ask
Nazis.
each.
Damn.
Similar. I'm gonna ask each of you who do you think is gonna win the election, Cassie? Ontario election.
Oh, Doug Ford.
For Doug Ford.
I hope it's not Doug, but I think it's.
You think it's gonna be? What do you think?
Yeah, I was out in Etobicoke last weekend. Doug Ford.
Oh yeah. See, I'm the only Orange Crush NDP.
But do you know what the worst thing is? I don't actually really care very much for the provincial election. I just don't keep up with it. I don't know who else is even running other than Doug Ford.
Now,
that's I think
for the first time in a long time, the NDP gets to be the party around which people can strategically vote. Usually, when people in Canada say strategic voting, it means don't vote for the NDP, go Liberal. But I think they have a shot at a minority government. Okay, cool. Thank you for being on the inaugural Your Hood's a Joke podcast. Edward, Foad, Cassie. I'm Danish Anwar. You can check us out on YouTube, iTunes. Check out our channel for a lot more pretty dark content. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you.
Ciao.